Well, good afternoon. Please find a seat and we'll go ahead and get ready for the third panel. My name is Dan Churchwell. I'm the Associate Director of Program Outreach at the Acton Institute, and it has been my delight to work alongside Micah Watson and his team here at Calvin to conceive of, facilitate, and fund, and just make sure that this conference happens. And so I want to thank Micah and his team here at Calvin for hosting this event and doing most of the logistics. It's my pleasure to moderate the panel on technology. I recently heard Patrick Deneen in another context articulate that he believes that this particular chapter in his book is the most under-reviewed but most pivotal to his book and to his argument. And so it'll be fun to work through the idea with this panel. They will each speak for roughly 20 minutes, and then we'll shoot for a good 20 to 25 minutes of Q&A. Let me introduce the panel first. Dr. Derek Sherman, here from Calvin, earned PhD from McMaster University. His interest in computers began early in his teens with his first computer, a Timex Sinclair ZX81, for the nerds in the audience. He is also interested in the various issues relating to faith and technology, and he has taught computer science at both Redeemer University College as well as Dordt College prior to his coming to Calvin. If you look at his faculty page, he has a lot of scholarship, both in one book in particular called Shaping a Digital World, and then multiple lectures, articles that he has published on the intersection of faith and technology. I recommend that to you highly. Our second panel member is Dr. Alan Noble, PhD from Baylor University. He currently is an assistant professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University and is the editor-in-chief of Christ and Pop Culture, and is also the author of numerous articles found in The Atlantic, Christianity Today, First Things, Vox, and many other outlets. He is very interested particularly in issues related to pluralism and secularism, and his recent book, Disruptive Witness, Speaking Truth in a Distracted Age, is a wonderful foray into the philosophical and sociological implications of Charles Taylor's larger work, A Secular Age. Thirdly, Dr. Justin Barnard from the Honors College at Union University, where he teaches philosophy and in the political science department, earned his PhD from Florida State University. And his teaching is motivated by the perennial philosophical question, what does it mean to live wisely and well? His scholarly interest and published work focus primarily on the issues of philosophy of religion, bioethics, technology and human flourishing, and the philosophical legacy of C.S. Lewis. And he asked me to let everyone know that he is a husband and a father of two wonderful sons in a household obsessed with basketball. And also, more interesting to this panel, he does not have a Facebook account and has never posted to Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, or any other social media platform. So, with that, Patrick Deneen's chapter on technology, he posits a very interesting quote in the middle of the chapter. He says, a technological society like our own comes into being through a new kind of political technology, and that replaces the ancient commendation of virtue and aspiration to the common good with self-interest, the unleashed ambition of individuals as emphasis on private pursuits over a concern for public weal and an acquired ability to reconsider any relationships that limit personal liberty. And then he ends the chapter with this provocative quote. We are certainly right to congratulate ourselves for the successes of our technology, but we are also right to worry about the cost of our technological society. Our culture of technology was premised from the very start on a false definition of liberty, and it now seems to be leading us ineluctably into the condition of bondage to the consequences of our own fantasy. So, as we unfold and unpack these issues from Dr. Deneen, please welcome first to the microphone, Dr. Derek Sherman.
Thank you for the invitation, and it's an honor to be among these panelists here today. Deneen's chapter on technology is entitled Technology and the Loss of Liberty. This is an ironic title for a computer scientist, and you wouldn't hear this at an engineering or computer science conference, since technology is often credited with increasing human autonomy and freedom and liberty, consistent with the goal of modern liberalism. Deneen's book opens with the observation that many writers and filmmakers have painted pictures about the threat posed by technology. Someone once observed that the artists get there first, and artists have been warning about our technological age for some time. The Frankenstein narrative is evident in many science fiction novels and recent movies as well. In contrast, among engineers and computer scientists, there is a naive optimism about technology. The mantra of Silicon Valley is to bring disruption to the antiquated and broken way of doing things and to provide a frictionless digital solution. One book with the title Infinite Progress includes the following subtitle: How Technology Will Ultimately Solve Ignorance, Disease, Poverty, Hunger, and War. This is almost religious language. Sentiments like these are explicit examples of what David Noble wrote, the technological enterprise has been and remains suffused with religious belief. The idea of using technology to master nature was suggested by Francis Bacon, of course. We use technology to achieve power, and we do so by putting nature to the rack. In fact, the use of technology to achieve human control, I think, goes all the way back much earlier to the Tower of Babel. Humans building their own bridge between heaven and earth, grasping for freedom through their own wits, and creating a name for themselves. Deneen claims on page 103 that it is less a matter of our technology making us than of our deeper political commitments shaping our technology, unquote. At the very least, I think they feed into each other. But I would suggest further that the quest for human autonomy and control, evident here, precedes liberalism and technology and is fundamentally about human rebellion against God's laws and norms, going back to the Garden of Eden. This trust in technology is referred to as technicism, the belief in technology as savior of the human condition. But the truth is that the liberty promised by technology has not really panned out. In fact, it appears to be leading us into new forms of bondage, as Deneen observes. One of the themes in Deneen's book is that governments animated by an ideology of modern liberalism have promised increasing individual freedom, but have ironically and inevitably resulted in larger, more controlling governmental apparatuses to regulate all areas of life, as virtue is abandoned for state control. This same theme we can see mirrored in technology, I think. The internet promises increasing knowledge and connection, but in a well-known article by Nicholas Carr, Is Google Making Us Stupid? He writes, "My mind now expects to take in information the way the net distributes it, in a swift moving stream of particles. Once I was a scuba diver in a sea of words. Now I zip along the surface like a guy on a jet ski," unquote. Carr further develops this thesis in his book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, where he suggests that we are turning into pancake people, spread wide and thin as we connect to a vast network of information. Recent research in neuroscience confirms this. Our technological activities gradually sculpt our brains in particular ways. Gary Small, a neuroscientist and author of the book iBrain, suggests that our high-tech revolution has plunged us into a state of continuous partial attention. Sherry Turkle, a thoughtful social scientist from MIT, has written a recent book, Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. In it, she explores how digital communications promised increased social connection, but she laments how certain technologies encourage us to sacrifice genuine companionship for simply interacting with something. Her most recent book is called Reclaiming Conversation, and she explores the loss of empathy that occurs when we sacrifice face-to-face communications for mere digital connection. These technologies held the promise to extend liberty and are now the source of reduced privacy, contemplation, and freedom. More recently, a book about big data by Kathy O'Neill titled Weapons of Math Destruction has the subtitle, How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. In it, she observes how computer algorithms, which may initially appear cold and neutral, amplify values, biases, assumptions by the organizations that use them. Big data sifts through vast oceans of data to find patterns, which are then used to inform decisions in areas as diverse as finance, banking, hiring, marketing, policing, education, and politics. While mathematical models allow decision-making to be more efficient, and they do reflect a certain reality in creation, they can be misdirected and misused. They can hurt the poor, target predatory ads to people, discriminate against minorities, perpetuate cycles of poverty, and so on, as Kathy O'Neill states in her book. Many decades ago, prophetic voices like Marshall McLuhan and Neil Poston already warned us that we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. Jacques Ellul warned about technique, the efficiency being applied to every human activity. Neil Postman warned about technopoly, a society in which technology is deified. His book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, is even more prophetic, I think, in our current political climate. Decades ago, Marshall McLuhan also suggested 4 laws for media. One law was the observation that if we push tech to its limits, it tends to reverse its original characteristics. For instance, in the case of the car, when it's used heavily, leads to a reversal of mobility in traffic jams and congestion. In the case of social media, it may promise vast social connections, but the more we use it, the more we are left alone together, sitting alone in a room with a glowing rectangle. This is the way of idolatry, actually. An idol promises everything, and in the end requires everything and delivers nothing. Most recently, the ideology of transhumanism has evolved, focusing on the notion of control of nature applied to our very own human selves. Transhumanism includes a presupposition of morphological freedom, an anthropology that assumes we are infinitely malleable, goes beyond restoring human capabilities, but moving beyond the range of normal human life and radically altering our bodies and minds. Cyborg interfaces, genetic enhancements, even growing a tail if we want to. In one extreme scenario, people talk about uploading our brains into a computer so that we can live forever. This is a highly reductionistic notion about what it means to be human, that somehow we are only defined by the physical interaction of particles in our brains, and if we can simulate that, we can move ourselves into another platform. This inevitably will move us further away from the norms of what it means to be a human being fully alive, and is based on faulty anthropology and presuppositions. Our technology also forms powerful liturgies. The business model for many services relies on revenue from targeted ads that require attracting as many eyeballs as possible, keeping them coming back. These nudges have become increasingly sophisticated, with some social media companies hiring behavioral scientists to help advise developers on tuning apps so they can play with users' dopamine levels. An early social media pioneer, Jeffrey Hammerbacher, once lamented in an interview with Businessweek magazine, quote, "The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads," unquote. The problem is not just with our time and our eyeballs, it gets to our hearts. Our habits and rituals are like liturgies that point our heart in a particular direction, as Jamie Smith has written in his Cultural Liturgy series, and technology comes packed with liturgies. Our digital devices foster habits that have significant shaping implications. The scriptures warn us to guard our heart, for everything you do flows from it. The heart is of strategic importance. Once it's captured, everything else follows along. We need to attend to our habits and rituals. The Christian philosopher Albert Borgman suggests that we need to cultivate focal practices instead, things like family meals, cooking, gardening, hiking. He suggests that these are things that take time and effort, but that they are the things that really matter. Other Christian traditions have other suggestions, and that the Orthodox Christian tradition has a rich set of historical practices that we can retrieve. Perhaps the best antidote to the challenge of the modern digital age lies in recovering the practices found in ancient spiritual disciplines, things like Sabbath keeping, scripture reading, prayer, fasting, solitude, silence, serving others. These practices take us back to virtues and norms, the very thing that liberalism has sought to free us from. Creation is designed in such a way that we cannot ignore these virtues and norms without consequences. Creation is like a rubber band that pushes back. In Chapter 5, Deneen describes also how the STEM disciplines are on the rise. The arts and humanities are in decline as people look for courses that will lead to jobs and to money. In his book, The Reason Within the Bounds of Religion, Nicholas Wolterstorff coins the term Baconian justification for learning as, quote, choosing those directions of inquiry which hold the greatest promise of yielding knowledge useful in altering our human circumstances in the most desirable ways. We see this in education as it turns from shaping people into providing skills for a technical world and a good salary. The number of students in humanities continue to decline. The original goal of education is to shape a person, but professors in the humanities, as Deneen notes, have also rejected virtues and norms that have animated the great books. True liberty means not being bound by traditional norms and virtues. In the words of Deneen, professors in the humanities showed their worth by destroying the very thing they studied. And in fact, that's the thing we also need in computer science and engineering. We need to teach our students about these things too. They also need to be participating in these great books. A recent New York Times article highlighted how a recognition of the dark side of technology has led to a scramble to add ethics courses in computer science departments at Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. But can simply bolting on an ethics course to an existing curriculum create ethical engineers and computer scientists? The importance of cultivating virtues and norms is also crucial for shaping computer scientists who will be in turn shaping our culture and our technology. What I missed in Deneen's book was the suggestion that we need to forge a vision for normative technology that can contribute to human flourishing. Unlike the Amish, whose rejection of technology Deneen refers to, we need to see technology as a legitimate human cultural activity which we perform in response to God to obediently unfold the latent potential in creation. I appreciated the distinction that a former colleague, Al Wolters, author of Creation Regained, makes about the difference between structure and direction. Creational structures endure, but they can be directed either in obedience to God's intentions or more towards more disobedient uses. The common question of whether technology is good or bad is a false dichotomy. Technology is, in fact, part of God's good creation. But the important question is this: in what direction is it pointed? Do we direct technology towards uses that make us more like the people God intends us to be and closer to the kind of world He wants us to shape, or towards disobedience? We need to do more to engage the normative unfolding of technology, and this includes training our engineers and computer scientists to do so responsibly. In his book, Capitalism in Progress, the Christian economist Bob Houtswart writes the following, quote, if man and society ignore genuine norms, they are bound to experience the destructive effects of such neglect. This is not, therefore, a mysterious fate which strikes us. Rather, it is a judgment which men in society bring upon themselves. To ignore given norms out of an a priori illusion of autonomy only seems to afford freedom, but in the long run it removes genuine freedom. Genuine laws or norms are pointers that guide us along a safe and passable road. Apart from norms, our paths run amok, unquote. And these are the norms that responsible engineers and computer scientists need to discover with the help of social scientists, philosophers, economists, political scientists, and others. Thank you.
Please welcome Alan Noble.
All right, thank you. Let me just use my technology to pull up what I wrote. So what I want to do today is to address sort of the two broad issues here. One is obviously this question of contemporary liberalism, modern liberalism, but then also contemporary technology. And I want to focus on how this technology, shaped by modern liberalism, perpetuates some of the failures that Deneen identifies. Two values of modern liberalism define our use of the internet, particularly social media: the freedom to choose our identity and meritocracy. The former is not really a choice for us, it's a kind of moral imperative. We must define ourselves in a society in which we've been liberated from meaningful roles, relationships, and obligations previously imposed by custom and nature. So the quest to find ourselves is one of the most basic stories in our culture. The modern hero is one who can take the burden of meaninglessness and forge an identity that is meaningful to him or herself. And this is where meritocracy comes in, because no one can merely discover who they are and be satisfied. Wouldn't that be nice? Discovery must involve expression. And my expression of identity is competing for the scarce resource of attention from my family, my friends or neighbors, or increasingly global strangers on the internet. Competition comes to define the expression of my identity and therefore my identity itself. Adding to this, the ideal of social mobility, whether realistic or not, in a global economy where so many of the old hierarchies have been, at least allegedly, knocked down, produces an intense burden to be successful. So even while pundits decry participation trophies, there's hardly anything in our society which isn't in some way a competition, a fight for scarce resources. For example, the top AR reading scores are posted in the hall of my third graders' school. So the top 10 students are known to everyone. It's the third grade. My daughter's number 10, so we're working on that. My college seniors, and for those of you who teach, or maybe if you are a college senior, you're probably feeling this. The anxiety of losing the 4.0, having to experience, one of the most beneficial experiences for me in my college career was losing that 4.0, the freedom that was lifted off my shoulders. Now I don't have to be perfect. I can just study. It didn't actually go that way. I mean, I still was anxious about grades. Other students, however, don't seem to have this burden, at least on the surface. In fact, large segments of society similarly seem to drop out of the mainstream game of life after deciding that they don't have much of a chance to win. Why compete if you know you'll lose? For these students, online gaming, for example, a different sphere of competition can fill a void. And the alluring possibility of making millions of dollars as a professional gamer or streamer gives them hope. Recently, Bloomberg, Forbes, I don't know, somebody gave a top 10 list of the most successful YouTubers. We're talking tens of millions of dollars a year. And most of them were streaming video games and giving commentary. Make of that what you will. There are millions of other ways of dropping out, of course, right? Or finding smaller or less stressful races in life to compete in. My only point here is that contemporary people are driven by an overwhelming sense of competition, the awareness that the world produces winners and losers, and even people who seem to be uninterested in this competition, you know, the people, those millennials who aren't working very hard, etc., are sometimes the ones most deeply captivated by it. Combined, our contemporary idea of the freedom to create an identity, we'll call this expressive individualism, and meritocracy tend to cause a profound spiritual, physical, and mental harm. Tend to, not always, but more often than not, I think. Choice paralysis, for example, makes finding careers or a spouse a dreadful experience. For those of you who have spoken to seniors this time of year, as they're having to think about, do I go to grad school? Do I get an internship? What do I do? Do I follow my girlfriend or boyfriend across the country? He hasn't proposed. Do I follow him? Choice paralysis. What if I make the wrong decision in life? The stakes in expressing your identity are incredibly high because the attention and approval you receive gives your life weight, but expression exposes you to public shaming. I could many examples of this, right? College loans, personal debt, and rapidly evolving marketplace create a sense of uncertainty and anxiety. And so, and here's my point, the online space offers a relatively low-cost way for people to promote their identity and to compete. But in the process, social media dramatically increases all of these same anxieties by quantifying, normalizing, and globalizing competition. As with other technologies, and Deneen makes this point well, I think, social media is mostly just responding to the demands of liberalism. Designers at Instagram and Facebook did not sit around strategizing how to make us more lonely or anxious, although they don't seem too concerned to fix those problems. They provided us the tools for self-expression and competition, which we valued already because we assumed certain truths about liberalism. Social media is a perfectly crafted tool for the modern liberal self, particularly insofar as expressive individualism is an integral part of liberalism. These platforms offer seemingly limitless tools to carefully, expertly craft our personal brand and promote it to a global audience. The lines between a product, a brand, a celebrity branding themselves, and the daily content of just a regular internet user, social media user, has blurred almost entirely, which is a boon for marketers who wish to make their ads look more organic, but it is troubling. But it burdens the user with the language, rhetoric, and standards of the marketing industry. So you can see this in young people who worry about brand differentiation. Although they might not use that term, instead they talk about posting things that, they talk about the need to have a thing online. Well, that's not my thing. You know, I need to have a thing as I'm posting, something that separates me. Just like smartphone and app designers, entertainment content creators, and marketers, regular social media users are competing for attention, that scarce resource that drives so much of the online economy. We crave the gaze of other humans, as if the more we are observed, the more real our presence in the world is. Social media platforms have fostered this craving through the ubiquitous use of metrics. You know how many people saw your Instagram story, how many likes your photo or comment received, how many retweets you got. And we don't just crave positive attention either. Consider the mainstream popularity of anonymous trolling, or the self-aware YouTube manifestos of mass shooters. Attention is its own good. The platforms are largely neutral to the kinds of identities people display. What they are not neutral about is the value in displaying your identity. Now, the result is that this tool, which we thought would make it easier for us to express our identity, to become actuated people, and open up new spaces for us to be successful, has only increased the demand for self-expression and multiplied the competition exponentially. We become acutely aware of our inadequacies and failures. More attractive, smart, popular, hip, wealthy, educated, respected, followed, liked, subscribed to people are all around us. We have access into people's homes, their cars, their families. And even though we know that most of these photos have been carefully edited to portray the best side of someone's life, the cumulative effect is the same: to cultivate a sense of inadequacy. Why can't I have my life that together? Why aren't my kids that well dressed? Why doesn't my husband work out? I'm channeling my wife there, I think, probably. Don't tell her I said that. Our inability to internalize the knowledge that people's online image is manicured is no different, really, than our inability to separate the truth and fantasy in advertising. It's the same thing. So no one consciously believes, for example, that laundry detergent will make their lives richer or happier, but the commercial that claims this is effective nevertheless. So even while we are aware of the unreality of social media, it still shapes our desires. We are more aware than ever of our need to discover or craft a unique identity because we are more aware of the alternatives, all the potential lifestyles available to us. And the competition between those alternatives has never been so clearly quantifiable. We are free to be anyone, regardless of nature or custom or obligation, but that freedom produces choice paralysis and the need to justify ourselves through self-expression. In response, we have to work harder to define ourselves and to compete for attention, praise, clicks, likes, jobs, swipes. Thankfully, social media is here to help. They continue to develop new tools to aid us in our self-expression and competition, new ways of creating or sharing content, new ways of editing photos, new people to connect with. In this sense, social media fits what David Foster Wallace described as malignant addiction. This is a quote. Something is malignantly addictive if, one, it causes real problems for the addict, and two, it offers itself as relief from the very problems it causes. A malignant addiction is also distinguished for spreading the problems of addiction out and in interference patterns, creating difficulties for relationships, communities, and the addict's very sense of self and soul. In this essay, E Pluribus Unum, Wallace was making this case about television, actually, and people's addiction to television in the 1990s. And I would just say that if it was true in the 1990s about television, how much more is it true today? Our use of technology often exacerbates the very problem it promises to cure: our loneliness, our sense of being lost. None of this is hidden. I'm not surprising you with any of this. We are all almost all aware that the slight chemical thrill, the dopamine we get from seeing likes pile up on Instagram, is a sad and empty substitute for something more substantial in life. Yet we keep going back. A non-trivial percentage of people in America, I would suggest, self-medicate through technology. The Western world leaves them alienated, rootless, alone, anxious, medicated, with decreased sex drives or impotence because of medication, lustful because of ubiquitous pornography and objectified bodies, and depressed because they can't act on the lust because of the medication. Far from encouraging us to cultivate virtues, our society openly and boastfully promotes the cultivation of unrestrained desires, only it doesn't give us any meaningful way to achieve those desires, leaving us both unsatisfied but also impassioned. Now, a smartphone offers a diversion from modern life that is immediate and extremely high quality, endless in content and variety, relatively safe, and highly affordable relative to the amount of entertainment value you can get out of it. Of course, entertainment has always been used to pacify and sedate a population so that they don't see their own sorry condition. The difference is that modern technology is scientifically designed, as Derek pointed out, scientifically designed to distract us. There's a level of intentionality, psychology, physiology, the variety of our technology that is just historically unparalleled. I worry about the ability of these distractions to keep us from contemplating our existential condition and so our need for Christ. For most people, addressing deeply ingrained societal ills like the disordered definition of freedom as limitlessness that undergirds liberalism feels simply unimaginable. Our harried lives do not permit that kind of effort. Plus, global communications have made us aware of all the evils in the world constantly. To cope with the psychic burden of the modern world, technology offers us an easy relief. And I suspect that for many Americans, the experience of holding their smartphone in their hand, pulling it out of their pocket or their purse or their backpack, even before they unlock it, produces just a small release of dopamine. It's an $800 security blanket. And many of us need this security blanket in a world where the church's role has receded, mediating institutions have been largely abandoned, families are geographically scattered and often shattered, and the last two institutions left standing are the state and the market, which grow more invasive and less humane with each day. Now, I've painted a perhaps slightly bleak picture of technology, which may give the wrong impression that I am a Luddite. If you have the misfortune of following me on Twitter, you know that I am not advocating a complete withdrawal from social media and technology. I don't believe that the ability to communicate or broadcast opinions necessarily leads to expressive individualism or an overwhelming need to compete. And while my focus has been on the technology, I think that without uprooting the deeper cultural assumptions that drive this tech, we cannot meaningfully alter the harm it is causing. So long as the average American believes that his or her life is justified according to how well they discover an identity, express it, and compete in a marketplace of personal brands, railing against the way social media provides the technique for this conquest will do very little. In addition, we should be cautious to not to unreflexively accept the liberal assumption that the answer to all our problems is volunteerism. A standard response to someone complaining about social media or tech is to reply, well, if you don't like it, don't use it. It's a free country. Which is a fine reply if you're talking about personal preferences in soda. But it's something different altogether when the preference contributes to the welfare of communities and society. We are not going to individually opt out our way from the soul-harming effects of technologies that have been shaped by liberalism. In some cases, we have moral obligations to abstain, but in general, I believe our energy is better spent challenging the basic assumptions of modern liberalism: unrestrained freedom, expressive individualism, a view of competition as the basic state of nature, the denial and conquest of nature, and the rejections of virtues as oppressive customs. The church and Christian education, I would say, have a tremendous role in challenging these ideas. Thank you.
Dr. Barnard, please.
Well, had I known what my two colleagues were going to say, I would have asked to have gone first, because I suspect that there is a sense in which what I have to say today is going to reiterate some of what you have already heard, simply reiterating it more obscurely. David Brooks says in Bobos in Paradise that an intellectual entering mid-career should be sitting on at least 3 panel discussions a month, because at the end of life, the intellectual who sits on the most panels wins. I'm losing right now. But I'd still like to thank Dr. Watson and to thank the Acton Institute for the honor of sitting on this very distinguished panel, and thank my two colleagues as well for their very thoughtful reflections. I'll try to add my piece, and I'll try to add it shortly so that we can have a good time for conversation. In his chapter on technology and why liberalism failed, Patrick Deneen suggests, as has already been mentioned, that both our anxieties and our optimism about the prospects for a technologized future are slightly misplaced, since both attitudes tend to treat technology itself as, quote, something that shapes and even remakes us, and does so with a kind of iron law of inevitability, end quote. Deneen argues that, quote, technology does not exist autonomous of political and social norms and beliefs, but its development and applications are shaped by such norms, close quote. Thus, the technologies that we both fear and celebrate today are, according to Deneen, ultimately a reflection of our prior commitment to classical liberalism's conception of freedom and the new political technology to which it gave birth. Now, Deneen is obviously right to point out that technologies don't exist apart from socio-political contexts. After all, human beings are the ones that produce the technology. Moreover, despite the rise of automation, technology does not and will not ever exhibit intentionality. That is a characteristic feature of consciousness. So to treat technology, as Kevin Kelly does in asking what technology wants, is to afford to technology a set of powers that it simply does not possess in and of itself. Insofar as both technophobes and technophiles treat the development of our technological artifacts as something that proceeds autonomously with a kind of iron law of inevitability, they are, as Deneen points out, missing part of the larger picture. But Deneen is only right by half, I think anyways, and this might be a place where there's some slight disagreement between myself and Dr. Noble. I'm not sure, because I think he seems a little bit more sympathetic to the idea that technology reflects our prior commitments, and I think that's right, but I think that's only right by half. For while it is correct to point out that technologies like automobiles, suburban back patios, or Facebook, and these are all technologies that he discusses in his chapter, while it's right to point out that such things are rooted in our prior commitment to a particular conception of freedom, it is mistaken to suggest, as I think Deneen does, that such things are not making a significant, if not a primary, contribution to our loneliness. And I think Dr. Noble did an outstanding job of showing how they may in fact be. And this is because the relationship between our philosophical commitments and the technological artifacts that result from them is reciprocal. What we make may reflect what we want, but what we make also makes us. And Dr. Sherman alluded to a quotation that's attributed to Marshall McLuhan, that we shape our tools and thereafter they shape us, is a way of thinking about this. Few present-day thinkers are more keenly attuned to this reciprocal relationship than the motorcycle mechanic who moonlights as a political philosopher, Matthew Crawford. Like Deneen, Crawford recognizes that the shape of our technology reflects an underlying commitment to a particular view of human agency. And in his most recent book, The World Beyond Your Head, Crawford suggests that what lies at the root of our present view of human agency in the modern West is a Kantian account of autonomy, according to which freedom means choice, and, quote, choice is understood as a pure flashing forth of the unconditioned will, close quote. For Crawford, the general shape of our present technology is predicated upon this Kantian conception of autonomy precisely because so much of it seeks to realize the choice of the unconditioned will as efficiently as possible. And the algorithms that go to work when one summons or commands Alexa or Google are in fact so oriented. That's their job, that's their aim, to realize as efficiently as possible the unconditioned choices of the will. Increasingly, as Crawford points out, a fully smart technology would be able to leap in and anticipate our will, using algorithms that discover the person revealed by our previous behavior or our previous choices. Crawford finds Kantian autonomy as an ideal for human freedom deeply impoverished as a complete account of human agency. And I suspect that Deneen would agree. But unlike Deneen, Crawford displays greater sensitivity to the ways in which the technologies of automation reinforce this narrow view of human freedom as opposed to merely reflecting it. So much of Deneen's chapter is really on the ways in which technology simply reflects our prior commitment as opposed to the ways in which it might actually reinforce them. This is why Crawford spends so much time in his work defending the moral significance of the built environment, of tools in the shop, of physical objects in the world that school us, that's his term, I love it, of communities of skilled practice who shape the wills of their members in keeping with traditions, rituals, and standards of excellence. In short, for Crawford, it is the prospect that we might encounter technology as heteronymous, that is, as opposed to our wills, as when I skin my knuckles on the engine of my car because the wrench in my hand stripped the head off a bolt. It is the possibility of that sort of encounter, one in which I don't get what I want, that makes it profitable to attend to the structures of technology in the way that Deneen does not. Now, my point in calling attention to this difference between Crawford and Deneen is not to criticize Deneen for failing to write a book that he wasn't writing. There's a great deal of shared ground between their two perspectives. Nonetheless, Crawford's use of the Kantian distinction between autonomous and heteronymous wills, as opposed to Deneen's more narrow frame of applied technology merely reflecting our prior commitment to liberalism, opens up possibilities for thinking about how some technologies may be more conducive to human flourishing than others. Although he does not put it like this, let me suggest that what is deeply behind Crawford's tacit defense of the value of heteronomy is a philosophical instinct about genuine human agency, something that Crawford regards as an achievement, not a property with which human beings are born. Specifically, I think Crawford recognizes that the possibility of failure, that's the insight, the possibility of failure is a necessary condition for the cultivation of genuine human agency, and thus of human flourishing. By definition, Kantian heteronomy involves the possibility of having one's will conditioned by something else. That is, the possibility of not getting what one wills. In short, it entails the possibility of failure. Yet it is precisely that possibility that Crawford takes to be essential to one's formation as a moral agent. This is why Crawford finds technologies that reinforce the Kantian ideal of autonomy so problematic. It is not merely because they reflect an account of political freedom that Crawford now regrets having embraced, as I think Deneen's chapter on technology largely suggests. It is rather that such technologies eliminate the risk of friction, if not outright failure, that is essential to flourishing as a moral agent. And as an aside, I think this concern is deeper and more subtle than the general picture that Deneen paints of oscillating between praise and misgivings in his chapter on technology. Yet as Crawford senses, this paradoxical relationship between the possibility of failure and human flourishing is one that we no longer recognize in our society. And the very structure of our technologies increasingly reflects this ignorance. So let me put it like this. Today's technology aims at nothing less than the elimination of the possibility of tragedy. Today's technology aims at nothing less than the elimination of the possibility of tragedy. The world we want is a world in which the tragic is no longer possible. Now, we rightly regard such things as poverty, drug addiction, violence, cancer, aging, and death as tragic things. And so we go to war against such things with all of our technological capacities. And it's interesting to me that so many of these things use the military metaphors, right? We have a war against drug addiction, a war against poverty, a war against cancer. And it would be interesting, just as maybe as something to talk about even in Q&A, to tie this into the notion that, as Dr. Sherman pointed out in his talk, that there's a religious element to this. There's a whole host of cultural liturgies that are associated with our war against all of these things, including tithing, right? We give to this war, we contribute to this war, we wear certain symbols, we wear certain clothing. We're at war with all of these tragic things. But as tragic as all of these things are, none of them are ultimately regarded as the greatest tragedy of all. For even if we were to win these battles, using our technological capacities to eliminate the possibility of poverty, drug addiction, cancer, violence, aging, and even death, one possible tragedy would remain, namely the possibility that I would fail to realize or live fully in keeping with my autonomous desires. Now this tragedy, what we might think of as the failure of authenticity, or as I think Dr. Noble put it, forging an identity, right? This is the greatest tragedy for us. It is a tragic possibility which must be eliminated by our technological powers. Generally speaking, the world that we are attempting to build is not merely a world which reflects a commitment to liberalism's conception of freedom. It is rather a world in which the very possibility of risk or failure or tragedy has been removed. The possibility of injury or death on the road will be removed by self-driving cars. The possibility of poor health will be eliminated by advances in medical technology together with constant surveillance. What do you think those Fitbits are for? The possibility of boredom will be exterminated by the endless stream of entertainment that will forever be available once we have conquered death. And the possibility of anxiety, as Dr. Noble talked about, generated by the fear of missing out or the fear of forging an authentic identity, will be eradicated by the algorithms that ensure that you won't fail, perfectly curating your life in response to the expression of your autonomous desires. This, by and large, is the world that we're presently building, perhaps because it's the world that we think we really want. So what is wrong with a world in which the possibility of tragedy has been eradicated? If Crawford is right, such a world is one in which genuine human agency, and hence human flourishing, is impossible. Indeed, as C.S. Lewis writes, you always have to have a quote from C.S. Lewis, the alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. Our technological efforts to create what we regard as heaven on earth may in fact be resulting in hell. If this is right, then human flourishing may depend upon a defense of the value of heteronomy. And while I'd prefer not to put the point in Kantian terms, Crawford's insights here are, I think, more fruitful than Deneen's. The deepest tragedy with respect to human flourishing is not the possibility that the choices of our unconditioned wills might fail to be realized. Rather, the deepest tragedy with respect to human flourishing is that our wills might fail to be properly conditioned by the good. And by definition, avoiding the latter tragedy involves the cultivation of virtue. And as I think Crawford rightly recognizes, the cultivation of virtue requires the flesh and blood friction of a built environment in which someone does not always get what she wants. In my view, the great challenge of the 21st century is whether and to what extent we will choose, and yes, I'm aware of the irony, is whether and to what extent we will choose to forego technologies that eradicate the possibility of tragedy in the interest of preserving the type of risk that is essential to the cultivation of virtue. On an individual level, this calls for a measure of courage and practical wisdom that I'd be the first to admit I don't have. And on a societal level, partly because of the failure of liberalism that Deneen so eloquently articulates, I am not optimistic that solutions to this practical challenge will come from the body politic, though perhaps they will come from the monasteries. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists, for the provocative comments. I will start with the first question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. In 2016, the World Economic Forum articulated this idea of the fourth industrial revolution. And the authors argue that there is something that separates this industrial revolution from the three previous, and that is in the velocity, scope, and systems impact of this industrial revolution is so different. In other words, the pace of change and the speed at which change happens is such a different thing that we don't quite know what to do with it. That might be leading to some of this anxiety that some of you have said. And so here, in their most recent book, Brett Frischman and Evan Selinger wrote a book called Re-Engineering Humanity. And there's a quote here: the Industrial Revolution turned the assembly line into a template for almost all of human activity, schools, hospitals, government offices, etc. And Deneen doubles down on that and argues that even the political system of liberalism is this political technology. He would include that. Well, so to dovetail that with what I just said, they're arguing that instead of a century of an industrial revolution unfolding, that the changes are happening about every decade. So it's happening 10 times as fast, give or take. And so if the industrial revolution changed us and we made humanity and formed humanity by all of these other liturgies that's been used, do you think this speed of change and is contributing to the anxiety we're talking about, this pace of change? Do you think that's accurate, that is leading to some of the anxiety we hear about on all fronts?
Shall I start? Okay. Yes. I think. Well, I say this as I recently read McAfee's book. It's McAfee and Bjornson from MIT wrote the book, The Second Machine Age, where they identify some of the same things, where they're noticing that automation is continuously accelerating, that if you track GDP and jobs, that in the last couple of years, although they've been pretty consistent over the last almost century, that in the last number of years there's been a bit of a break. There's been an increasing amount of products being made while less employment, and so they're pointing to the fact that that might be the fact that we've reached an age where suddenly the amount of automation that we're experiencing is not replenishing jobs in the same way that other transformations in history have done. And their suggestion, I think, is a wise one. We don't have to, I think, see technology as autonomous, sort of this deterministic notion that it's this bus that's on its way and we're hapless passengers on it, but that I think they make some recommendations about different types of regulations that could be put in place. I think technique is this sort of spirit of the age, like Jacques Ellul wrote about years ago, that if we allow maximum efficiency to kind of dictate all areas of life, that we'll end up with a kind of world that we probably don't want to live in. And I think engineers and computer scientists need to think about these sorts of things as well as they construct the tools of the future. I tell my students, think about what sort of things ought automation to be doing. There's some wonderful things that automation can do to increase human flourishing. What sort of things ought we be looking at a combination of humans and machines, and what sort of things ought not to be automated? What are the things that are uniquely human that we want to preserve? I think of things like efforts to build child-minding robots and elder care robots and these sort of things where we just have to decide, even though deep learning and robotics can mimic these sorts of things well, that's not the kind of world we want to live in. And I think that brings hope. I haven't lost hope yet.
Yeah, I mean, just building on Dr. Sherman's point here, I mean, I think so technology is not autonomous. Deneen makes this point, so we don't want to talk about technology as this runaway train. At the same time, you do, to some extent, it does seem like a lot of these technologies, innovation is happening, and the innovators, the designers, are not really entirely sure what they've created. And historically, there's been this lapse. There's a delay time between creation, innovation, and regulation. To a point where society decides, okay, here are the social norms and the legal norms we need in order to restrain these innovations, which are beneficial, but they do have some harms. When technology is advancing, when you have one major breakthrough every 100 years or so, you have plenty of time to make those adjustments as a society. When they're happening every 10 years or every 1 year, you really don't have. And so, although technology might not be autonomous, the sense in which it seems to be, a stream carrying us down, and we are picking up the pieces far in the past, that concerns me.
All right, please, we will start with students first. And if there are any students in the room, we'd like to give priority to the first several questions. To all, please make your questions as clear and concise as possible so we can get to as many questions as possible. Any students want to take a stab? All right, anyone else? Yes, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really fascinating panel. I really appreciate all the perspectives. I guess I want to focus a little bit on Justin Barnard's presentation and the theme of technology as a form of deliverance or a guarantee against tragedy. I think of the Matrix movies, right? And one of the problems with the first version of the Matrix supposedly is that it's too perfect, and then there's a kind of innate brokenness in human beings who crave tragedy or the ability to fail. Like that's why the first Matrix doesn't work. So they have to build in all these systems the architect does. As a reformed theologian, I like that as a picture of depravity, the apparent depravity of human being. I guess my question is, it seems like the implication there then is to have a much more constrained view of what we ought to be trying to do technologically, right? So we should be doing something that helps humans to flourish what we're going to accomplish or what we're able to accomplish. So I'm kind of both in warning about immunizing the esoteric, something like that. How do we retain the kind of vigor and pursuit of real progress, because that's capable, while maintaining this kind of a constrained sensibility about what we're actually able to accomplish? That's the core of my question. How do we continue to be motivated if we realize that the more we try to avert tragedy, the more likely we are to have catastrophic failures? I mean, if you look at the history of the 20th century, I don't think you can make any kind of argument that the techno-liberal complex has been successful in avoiding tragedy.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but part of what sounds like it's behind your question is whether or not your eschatology affects how you think about these things. Is that part of it?
Sure, I'd be interested in, yeah, if you could connect.
Yeah, because as I hear your question, I guess one of the things I'm thinking is that if you have a kind of post-millennialist vision that shapes your eschatology, that you might be more motivated to use technology to pursue things for the sake of the kingdom of God, because you may think that this is sort of a capacity that's ultimately been given to the people of God to do. And whereas if you have an amillennialist view or something like this, or even a premillennialist view, you might be a bit more skeptical about our capacity to bring in the millennial reign of Christ in some way, and thus you might be more reticent about pursuing these things. I'm not sure that I can answer the question in a way that avoids taking a position on that, but I'm going to try. Because I guess I'd rather have it not turn out that my answer is tied to a particular kind of eschatological outlook. I think the thing I was shooting for in my comments was one that I think was just implied by the answer that Derek just gave to the previous question, which is we need to pursue vigorously technologies that that put human beings at the center, and so they are scaled to human flourishing. They are guided and governed by human flourishing, by a picture of human flourishing. And I think part of the problem right now is that that's just simply not the case in any way whatsoever. Most of our technologies today are driven not by a sense of human flourishing on a human scale, and that involves our embodiment. They're driven by market capitalism, almost more than anything else, with no regard for human flourishing on a human scale. And I think you can especially see this when you look at things in the built environment. I mean, I flew up here today. Flying on planes is just a terrible experience, no matter how you cut it, because the people, no offense to the engineers in the room, who design planes, they're under pressure to design to maximize profit. They're not actually designing planes with human beings in view, how human beings are actually put together, as my colleague Dr. Watson knows even better than I do. And so I guess if I were to say, how do we pursue progress while avoiding running out too far, what I'd like to say is, we put human beings at the center of our normative vision for what technological progress we ought to pursue, and that sort of serves as our guide plan. That's the way I'd try to avoid the taking a stance on the eschatology.
I can quickly add one. I mean, another really important element is humility among engineers and computer scientists, kind of epistemological humility. We don't really know what some of the unintended consequences are going to be. There was an argument in the latest communications of the ACM, which is a flagship magazine of computer scientists and academic society of computer scientists, where one's arguing that we need no regulation. It's, with regulations, it's going to stifle innovation and so on. And then a counterpoint from someone saying, well, no, we need to be responsible. We need to make sure that we allow people to experiment with new ideas and so on in a sandbox type of situation, but not unleashing these things, with the kind of hubris that's required to do that. So humility is something that I try to inculcate in my students too, realizing that we don't always know what's going to happen, due to our finiteness, but also due to our fallenness.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, this is a question for all three of you. Thank you for interesting and provocative statements. I enjoyed listening to the variable levels of alarm and vigilance that you feel about the shaping power of technology. You all spoke about this, though, to different extents. You're encouraging us to be alert to the way that technology can encourage certain kinds of moral formation or attentional or attitudinal formation. With this in mind, I'm kind of curious if there are any technologies that you need to identify that you think are ultimately incompatible with good moral formation, and therefore that Christians, either as individuals or as members of communities, should basically reject.
You said, oh, yes.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I might as well just put it out there because I've already put it out there before in other contexts. I think so. I think Christians should get off social media, and I know I'm going to take all kinds of fire for that, and I'm happy to, but I cannot see good formation happening as a result of Christian participation in social media. I think its fundamental orientation is at odds with a virtuous life, because I think what it's principally designed to do is to reinforce the worship of the self ultimately, and I don't think that's compatible with Christian formation. So, and I know what. Let me actually anticipate at least one objection. I know that one of the things that people are going to say is, well, what about sharing? Right? What about sharing? There are plenty of technological platforms that you can use to share things, including email. Social media is just a different version of that, but its very structure, I think, is different from email. And we could have to talk about the details, but that's one. I'll just go out on a limb and say that one.
I would say no, we ought not to reject any technology out of hand. But let me nuance that and qualify that. I mean, I'm going back to this notion of structure and direction. I think all these possibilities in creation are in principle there are ways in principle to find God-honoring ways to use these and unfold these. The question is that these structures in creation need to be pointed in a particular direction. So I might imagine that there are lots of, I know there are lots of misdirected technologies that we can identify, and the question is what might a social networking platform look like if you were a developer who wanted to encourage not self-promotion, not curating a second self and so on, but creating a community online that might augment a physical community of some kind. What might that look like? I think it's possible. I have students right now who are doing a senior project creating a computer game, and they've been in contact with some philosophers and so on, thinking about what would a Christian or what would a computer game, a normative computer game, be like? What are the possibilities that we have yet to unfold in this space? Like, we're kind of stuck on these first-person shooter games and these other sorts of things, but what the range of possibility in this area of creation is so great, so wonderful. What are the untapped areas that we could explore? What are the kinds of stories we could share and the empathy we could bring to different scenarios? Like, I think the same thing with social media and technology, that there's creational possibilities and ways to direct all of these things in God-honoring ways, and that's what we're called to do. So.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you. I think there's a lot of wrong ways and dangerous ways, harmful ways to use media, right? So technology, lots of ways to use technology in the church that I think are subversive, that are not helpful, not conducive to worship. There are a lot of people who should not be on social media. There are a lot of kids and teenagers who should not have smartphones. There's just so I don't have any hard and fast rules for specific types of technology. If we're talking about computer or internet technology, there's some medical technology I think augmenting ourselves that I have ethical issues to, if we want to talk about that. But as far as computer technology, it's much less the device or the platform and much more the content, intent, and context that that trouble me. So I would tell specific people, like I might tell a student who I'm mentoring, you really shouldn't use this or that. Like, you need to cut Netflix out of your life because you're watching 10 hours of Friends because you're depressed instead of writing your paper, which is depressing you and making you feel worse. But I'm not going to announce to the world, don't watch Netflix.
We focused a lot on social media here, and Alan brought up something, that technology is all around us, not just social media or computer enhanced. And if you look at the last 100 years, one of the clearest developments or innovators of technology is warfare and the defense, and so that's a whole nother conference, that's a whole nother conversation. But DARPA, right, and if you're familiar with the Defense Advanced Research, it's their research arm, they're now contemplating, and these are on the record, they're major engineers saying, we now are trying to figure out ways to remove the human, because the human is becoming such an impediment to understanding how our defense systems and our offensive systems work. And so there are much other implications other than mere social media and your kids and the dopamine kicks that I think we should be concerned about, but we don't bring that in to a lot of our conversations. Next, yes.
I think you kind of missed the radicalness of the needs critique. But make the point by referring to a Paul McMaster person of yours, George Parker Grant.
Oh, yeah. Technology and justice.
Makes the distinction between tools and technology. And a lot of the stuff that you're talking about are tools. The technology is the interpenetration of knowing and doing, right? Of techne and logos. And in Aristotle, it's a third order mode of knowing. Right? I mean, Sophos and episteme and phronesis are all higher modes of knowing. Moral reasoning always precedes technical reasoning. Right? So for Aristotle, the idea of moral deliberation has always been providing limits, right? Because we're dealing with first principles, provide limits upon what techne can do. Right? The modern epoch is technological, right? It always subordinates moral reasoning to technological reasoning. So the technology is going to do what the technology is going to do. The researchers are going to do what the researchers are going to do. They're going to argue about the moral consequences after the fact. Right? So the moral deliberation is not a framework within which we do our technological work. That's the radicalness of it. This is the inversion that's taking place. So I guess my question is twofold. First of all, is there a way to resolve these seemingly incommensurate, the Aristotelian and the Baconian position? Is there a way to resolve the conflict between the two that is not simply a restatement of one of them? Right? Because I think typically we'll just try to resolve by restating some sort of variation of the Baconian position. And if we're just going to restate the Baconian position, what would give us confidence that we are going to actually impose limits on the sorts of things that you're so concerned about?
Well, I can say one thing briefly. I mean, this is the thinking among most of my colleagues that I've encountered in engineering and computer science is that technology is neutral. So we're not responsible. We're just making the tools. But it's up to the people who use them to use them for good or for there is this. I think if you start with the premise that technology is neutral, you push off your responsibility as a developer, and you push it off to the user, or you push it downstream. And it's very, very hard to convince, I've found, students that technology is not neutral. I mean, this takes a couple years of kind of, examples and kind of preaching about this in order to get, and I think that's a precursor for people in technology to accept that fact. And then what follows from that is responsibility. So that's one thing that on the education side that I know we need to do a better job of. And I think increasingly in technology schools and in organizations like the IEEE, Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, and others, there's a new focus on ethics when they're seeing how some of these things are unfolding. So that's one thing. And I think the second thing is to realize we need some regulation, that some of these things on their own, pushed by the forces of technique or of market forces, are not going to take us to places we want to go. And so there needs to be a willingness. And I think when we look at artificial intelligence right now, and automation, that's one area where I think we just have to recognize that this is something that we're going to want to talk about with all the stakeholders, not just with engineers. But yeah, it's difficult what you're saying.
So I suppose I have an obligation to respond, since this is a philosophical question, and I'm one of the philosophers up here. So to your first question, is there a way to adjudicate the debate between these two competing conceptions of the relationship between the good and the possible, the technical? Rationally, no, I don't think so. I think they are fundamentally incommensurable in a way that precludes a rational adjudication between these two competing views. Existentially, I do actually I'm more optimistic about a way of sort of showing who's the winner, but not without a lot of pain and discomfort in the interim. In other words, I think insofar as we are now living in a world where technical possibilities are not constrained by practical reason in the Aristotelian sense of that term or that phrase, we may have to just let things play out and live with the consequences until we reach the point that existentially we don't like the consequences anymore. And maybe we're starting to feel that a little bit in our society with the anxiety. I'm not sure though whether we've reached the point where people are ready to convert, but I do think it's something like conversion. I think it's a paradigm shift. It's not something that you can simply persuade someone of by means of a philosophical argument. So to your second question about optimism for restraint, in the near term, I'm not really optimistic. In the long run, I think I'm more optimistic because if the Aristotelian view is right, then existentially there is something that we might refer to as the recalcitrance of human nature that may in fact rebel against the consequences of this philosophical inversion, if that makes sense. That's right. Yeah.
Did you want to stand with that?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of faith that things are going to get better, at least in the short term. In particular, because it seems to me that this is a problem of conceiving of the common good, right? So can designers, are they even willing to conceive of the common good? And as you're putting out, your colleagues, most of them are saying, no, that's not our obligation. It's the user's obligation to figure out ethical uses of our products. And it's a similar problem. I mean, we have this, the same problem in politics. Can we talk about a common good, or can we only talk about individual goods and identity politics? Or is there such a thing as a common good? And I think there's the same problem in our markets. Can we talk about a common good? Can we ask the question, is this product or the way this corporation is acting good for society or not? So it almost seems like, it seems to me until we can begin having those conversations and until there's sort of widespread acceptance of this, even the existence of a shared common good, then I don't know. It seems like regulations, sometimes they'll help, sometimes they'll just get in the way, and we'll just be stumbling and always playing catch up, I think, is my fear, because how quickly things are moving.
There's some real connective tissue to our last session, too, on power, gender, and race. Lewis, because we have to mention Lewis, in Abolition of Man, the third chapter, there's a very fascinating several pages where he argues that the issue with power and technology is that it essentially becomes hundreds of men exerting power over billions of men. The more the technology, there's more and more people at higher levels of concentration with this technology that then exert power over billions of people. And there is a very interesting correlation, I think, that we could talk about power and those who build the technologies, because it's not really a contemplative, it doesn't seem, if you're using Aristotelian language, that it's not a contemplative race. It's a speed race. And so that obviously doesn't lead to a lot of contemplation on how will these things be used. Tristan Harris, formerly a design ethicist at Google, Jaron Lanier, who's now at Microsoft, is kind of an ethicist. There are people trying to wade into these issues, but their voices are very minute because of the speed. And I think that takes away from some of the contemplation that's needed to have moral thought, phronesis precede the tool. Another question. Yes, sir, in the green shirt.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on that. Who is the we that should be making the technological choices?
Yeah.
So I think we've concluded maybe it's not the technologists themselves. I think also along the lines of Alan Jacobs, like talked about the Oppenheimer principle, right? Who said one of the creators of the atomic bomb said, "Well, we'll just proceed to do what's technologically sweet, and then figure out what to do by that afterwards." Right? That works out well. So, and I think also the recent gene editing that happened maybe in China, right, where it seems like even the technological, or the professional body was not happy with what you did, but they don't really have the authority to prevent it, right? So if it's not professional organizations, if it's not the market, if it's not even necessarily state actors, because I don't think we're very optimistic about the ability of politicians to make unpopular but necessary choices, right? So who is the we that we should be looking to help us relate to technologies in virtuous ways? Is it the church? Is it the family? Is it, who is the we that should help us?
I think I laid my cards on the table at the end of my talk. I think in small scale. Maybe the first we is my family, right? Not necessarily to tell you, but at least to attempt to embody a faithful and virtuous relationship to the technological options that I have at my disposal. Would it be better if that we were larger? Yes, it would be. So that hence my reference to the Benedict option at the end of my talk. And I do take that seriously, not in the sense that I'm going to run away and live in a monastery, but in the sense that I think, in the same sense I think Crawford does. I think he sees these small communities of tool users. In his book, The World Beyond Your Head, he talks about a group of folks who repair and restore organs, pipe organs. He talks about glass blowers. And I think he's seeing in these small communities a kind of relationship to technology that cultivates human flourishing, and he's pointing to these communities as instances of what's possible. And so I think, we need to look on that sort of scale and in those sorts of directions to take our cues. But are any of these people going to have the authority to tell others how they ought to relate to technology? Well, no. Not any more than any of us do, but I think that's the direction.
I mean, it would be nice if we had authority figures like, I don't know, respected members of the church who could issue, statements that, society cared about. But, so many of these problems are, they're tied up with all these larger problems, right? What do you do in a society where, the idea of authority or the idea of a theologian or a priest or a pope or a philosopher who might have wisdom to share that you ought to listen to? I feel like I struggle to get my students to believe me that Paradise Lost is worth reading. How are we going to get, and that's such a minor thing, right? It's 3 classes, for crying out loud. Come on, guys. So how do we deal with this much bigger problem of, an authority figure in ethics or theology or philosophy coming along and saying, this particular technology is actually harmful, and I don't think we should be using it. And then choosing, right, to either the corporation saying, well, that's actually wisdom, I guess we'll stop making that. We'll get profits elsewhere.
I tell my students who head off to Google and Facebook, and some of them do, that, try to be a Daniel in Babylon. But I think we need bigger efforts too. The Lausanne conference in Cape Town from a number of years ago produced a book called The Cape Town Commitment, where they said, as Christians, we need to be taking the whole gospel to the whole world. And they actually specifically named technology and artificial intelligence as areas where Christians need to be more vocal. And I agree, and I don't think we've done a very good job. In fact, sometimes the church has just co-opted the technical liturgies into themselves without thinking and discerning well. One of my dreams is that we'll not only have a Henry Institute, but an Institute for Faith and Technology where we can invite leaders in the Christian church to speak on these matters and work with people in a pluralistic kind of society where people share common goals to talk about how we can shape technology in a way that leads to the common good and flourishing. That's a dream of mine, but hopefully one day something like that will be more intentional and we'll see something like that happening.
We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
What sort of alternative habits should we cultivate to combat the effects of the malignant addiction of digital technology?
Reading physical books is an excellent thing to do. Walking, I find, so I don't know how I graduated with a PhD. I often think this when I see my degree on the wall. One of the challenges I had is that I tend to fall asleep while reading. It just, I don't know, it just knocks me out. And so I have to walk and read a lot. But one of the effects it has is it's really hard to be distracted. It's really hard to focus on other things when you're walking and you've got to focus on, reading and walking and marking and these sorts of things. So, I mean, for me, walking, reading, regular times of prayer. I think one of the things that I've been prescribing is that we have to have a disposition of constant discernment, because the technology, the apps, the devices that you're concerned about being addicted to today are not going to be the same ones that will be introduced 2 weeks from now. And so, you mentioned, I think, smart a watch, right? So let's say you decide, all right, I can't have a phone. This is just too much for me. It's not healthy for me. I'm getting rid of this. But then you're like, well, a smartwatch is fine. I'll get one of those. And then all of a sudden, that's what the insidious nature, right? The word insidious, it's sneaking in and you don't realize the potential dangers. So I think we just need to have a disposition of perpetual checking ourselves. Am I using social media, for those of us who choose to, in a healthy way? Or do I need to pull back? Am I... what is my heart's desire as I'm posting on Instagram? What is, how am I using my time on my smartphone? Or, do I really need to have all these tabs open? Whatever it might be.
I'll just put in a quick plug for Andy Crouch's book, The Tech-Wise Family. I think it's a very wise book with some good practical advice in there as well. Each chapter he writes includes also a personal confession of sorts about how his own family has struggled with this. And I think it's a good resource with some practical stuff that you can implement in your own life.
I'm also a fan of just Crawford's emphasis on embodiment and tasks that remind us that we have bodies. Cooking, playing the ukulele, playing sports. These are things that I think can, make us in tune with who we are as human beings.
Please thank the panel with me.